Okay, twice during the conversation, Clara alluded to digital therapeutics and provided many examples. And one example that struck us was an example that Clara provided. It was of a company called WavePaths, and one must say it's a truly digital therapeutic. While most of the companies in digital therapeutics are apps or software platforms that collect data from the user, WavePaths is, and we repeat, a true digital therapeutic. Confused? Well, we're here to rectify that and provide the evidence.
We connected with Mendel Kaelen, the CEO of WavePaths. And before we go any further, we want to provide you a scientific nugget. After all, we are a science podcast, so it should come as no surprise to you. One of the PhD students at Imperial College published a paper with two of his mentors, Robin Carhart Harris and Professor David Nutt, in the journal Psychopharmacology. This 2018 paper explored an interesting argument for set and setting. We know from traditional ceremonies and dating back to the books written by Mike J. that singing, dancing, and drums in the Mesoamerican cultures were a big part of the experience. Then when mescaline came to be widely used, subjective experience could be modified depending on the type of music that was used. It's a different matter to the music that was created under the influence of psychedelics, but we will let you debate that in the bars, pubs, and if you avoid these drugs, over a cup of a stimulant, coffee. This paper, published in 2018, explored the relationship and the characteristics of the music played during psychotherapy sessions and its correlation to subjective experiences. In fact, it is now common knowledge among psychedelic therapists that patients would ask for a specific album or a type of mood music in a session. So, in a subjective world, how does one systematize this? The author of this paper, published in 2018, was Mendel Kaelen himself, when he was a PhD student at Imperial College, London. After graduation, Mendel took his hypothesis further and founded WavePaths. Let's hear from Mendel.
What we are building, we are actively translating our scientific insights all the time into a technology, which is in essence a musical instrument for the new generation of care providers that allows those care providers to have access to and work with a fully flexible, dynamic musical environment to constantly provide the best, ideal, supportive climate for patients undergoing these experiences, and find very simple, intuitive way to adapt music to the changing therapeutic needs of patients, and thereby increase the patient experience and the therapy outcomes, as well as the therapist experience. Not to be overlooked either, because being a psychedelic therapist is quite a challenge in itself, with many questions and unresolved questions in itself.
Instead of taking a clinical or neuroscience approach to psychedelics, we asked just how Mendel used a musical approach to research and now develop a product.
Sure. So my name is Mendel Kaelen. Originally, I'm from Holland. I'm born and raised in the north-east of the Netherlands. Went to university in Groningen, a city in the north. I originally studied biology, marine biology more specifically. At some point, I switched to neuroscience, really because I got increasingly fascinated by consciousness and the many questions that are unaddressed or unanswered around the nature of consciousness. In that period, I got introduced to psychedelics. This was in 2004, and I read everything I could. I became increasingly interested in both the historical richness around this topic, the anthropological, historical data around the use of psychedelic plants and mushrooms and cacti and you name it, all around the globe, and their therapeutic potential. And then I learned about organizations like MAPS and Hefter and the Beckley Foundation and others. And it became very clear that I wanted to contribute to this very young, emerging, but very promising field, in my opinion. Back then, university professors and colleagues were frowning whenever I even used the word psychedelic. that has changed very, very radically, especially the last few years. But yeah, long story short, I also experienced psychedelics myself. They really had a profound positive impact on how I view myself, how I relate to myself, how I resolved various personal problems in my life, how I connect with others, how I connect with my vocation in life, my creativity in life, all these other things. I lived in the Amazon jungle when I was 21 for a number of months, experienced ayahuasca, lived with a particular one shaman for 2.5 months, and eventually moved back to Holland, finished my bachelor degree, finished my master degree, and at the same time, I always had a very strong connection also with music and sound art, or sound more generally speaking. Grew up in a very musical family. Always at that moment, it felt to me as if I needed to make a choice between pursuing a scientific career to study psychedelic therapy, or pursue a creative career and make music or make sound art. Only when I was starting my PhD at Imperial College London, there was one moment where I realized that these two topics, psychedelics and music, are actually very closely related to each other. For strange reasons, it didn't dawn upon me earlier than that, but there was this one moment where I realized how closely connected they actually are. And my supervisors, my PhD supervisors, David Nutt and Robin Card-Harris, they're very supportive when I brought up various arguments of why I believed it was important to study the combination of music and psychedelics. And that became my main topic in my career. I studied and published various papers on brain mechanisms of music and psychedelics in combination, of the subjective experience of music under the influence of psychedelics, the experience of music in psychedelic therapy by patients, and various theories and hypotheses that followed out of that on how music can actually be, how the therapeutic potential of music can and likely should be leveraged more thoughtfully, more empirically. And that was for me also the reason to start WavePaths. I did a PhD, stayed on as a postdoc even for a while at Imperial, but at some point I realized that in order to really acknowledge and listen into this growing fascination and interest of music and psychedelics, and more broadly speaking, the therapeutic significance of altered states of consciousness and the various means in which we can access these and facilitate these, I really realized in order to pursue that deeper, I need and want to build my own organization that is concerned with nothing less and more than deepening our understanding of the role of music in psychedelic therapy, how music use can be leveraged to enhance therapy outcomes in psychedelic therapy, and the therapeutic potential of music in itself, and how we can leverage that in our wider society. And that has really been the core focus of WavePaths since the beginning.
How does music affect the psychedelic experience? Are there any clues to how this happens? What did Mendel find out in his work at Imperial?
That's a large question, but to summarize, absolutely. Very little, but this is where my research began, is looking at not only brain activity, but also brain connectivity and information exchange within the brain under the influence of a psychedelic, and comparing that with psychedelic plus music, or more broadly speaking, 4 conditions. No drug, no music, no drug, music, drug, no music, drug, music. So comparing those 4 conditions allowed us to really look into how information in the brain is processed differently, and how, in this case, psychedelics and music interact. And we see a number of things. We see huge distribution of resources to process, for example, various details in the music, like tone color. That happens in areas of the brain that are usually associated with language processing, like if your frontal gyrus, Broca's area. And the degree to which it happened correlated also with intensified feelings of wonder and awe, usually associated with peak experiences. Another study we looked at how music and psychedelics interact on the vividness of one's imagination. And we saw an increase in information flowing from the parahippocampus, which is a region usually associated with personal memory formation, towards the visual cortex. And the degree to which that information flow was enhanced was predicted by the presence of music and psychedelics together. And also that was modeled as a real and understood as a real synergy, a real interaction effect. So not 1 + 1 is 2, but 1 + 1 is, let's say, 10. So that study in particular suggested that there was a real interaction effect between psychedelics and music that interact to enhance information flowing from one region to another region much more than it would do without the presence of music.
Ancient practices grounded in music can get a new artificial intelligence-based product for psychotherapists? Is that the inspiration? So how does music influence therapy? Here is Mendel again.
Music plays an integral role in ceremonies all around the world when you look at traditional usage. Of course, there's examples where psychedelic medicines are not used, but music is, in those cases, a very central component to the religious medicinal ceremony. But wherever there is psychedelic plants involved, music is also deeply involved. If you speak with the shamans, they often explain that the music is as important as the plant medicine itself and as sacred as the plant medicine itself, and that they really work in synergy with each other. Now, when you move forward in time to the Western world in the 50s, where many scientists and therapists were trying to get their heads around this very new, novel class of compounds and their relevance for science and therapy, they also realized that people can have a wide range of very different experiences with exactly the same drug. And they then realized that the set and setting play a very important role in determining what kind of experiences people have. And they also already identified that the kinds of experiences that people have determine to a very large degree the therapeutic outcome of the experience, or one might say the therapeutic success of the experience. There are certain qualities in the experience that are most likely to facilitate sustained improvements in mental health and well-being afterwards. And those qualities of experiences have to do with autobiographical experiences, insight in causes of various psychological problems within oneself, reconnection with various parts of one's autobiography or events from the past and integrating them more constructively inside of oneself, or spiritual type experiences, mystical type experiences, or some humanistic psychologists might say peak experiences, experience of bliss and wonder. Those experiences that, if you look at all of them, have significant personal meaning, correlate with positive therapy outcomes. Now, when we again move forward in time from 50s, 60s, 70s into the psychedelic renaissance that is happening right now, and this is also where my research began, we are starting to validate some of these hypotheses more empirically, and then to add further insights in how these variables impact the experience, how we can work with these therapeutically. So when it comes to set and setting, one of the elements that we focus on primarily is music. Why? Because if you look at how psychedelic therapy is currently performed, developed, and implemented, that includes patients being carefully prepared for the session. It happens in a therapeutic relationship, but then during the acute experience, music is almost the only stimulus patients are exposed to.
So how does music influence therapy? We actually know a few underground therapists who use music for meditation and have said to us that some of their clients have cried with their music as a backdrop for the meditative experience.
So people undergoing psychedelic therapy are having this very powerful experience that is catalyzed in an interaction between the psychedelic medicine and the music to a very large degree. It's not the only way we can work with these psychedelic medicines, but this is the way psychedelic therapy is currently designed, developed, and implemented. So doubling down on understanding the role of music in psychedelic therapy, and also to your point, to kind of link this maybe with some examples of patient experiences. At my work at Imperial, I worked on what was a clinical trial studying psilocybin, the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, in a therapeutic format for patients that suffered from severe depression. And what was very clear is that with one and the same song, one individual can have one of those experiences that I just described, profoundly, personally meaningful experiences that are truly life-changing in the real meaning of that word. While another individual with exactly that same song entered a state of confusion, anxiety, paranoia, dissociation, you name it, experiences that if these experiences would be more chronic and sustained, can be not only challenging, but traumatic to such a degree that the symptoms are worsened, and the patient will leave this experience worse than how he or she entered the experience. So music can both make or break the experience, one might say. Music can be both a source for healing, as it really can be a source for destruction. I really became confident that music has that power. Now, when we take that information and we look at what's happening right now in the world, where so many clinical trials are being developed and so many clinics are getting formed to offer psychedelic therapy to patients, which is fantastic, because mental health care is in this has found itself in this dead-end road right over the last decades, and there's this huge need for innovation. And psychedelic therapy is clearly offering a potential innovation when it comes to mental health care, and a very profound potential. But when we look at what's happening with all of these clinical trials and all these clinics, one of the main challenges that those care providers are facing is that in essence they are dealing with a care model that is radically different than any care model that people are trained to perform. Psychedelic therapy is not pharmacotherapy. Patients are not given a drug and expected to be better as a result. It's also not psychotherapy, how we're used to think about psychotherapy. Although it has more, I would argue, more commonalities with psychotherapy. But in reality, it's really a mixture of many things. It has acute pharmacological effects on the brain. It has, for example, effects on neuroplasticity. It has definitely effects on mood that can be explained to a large degree with some of these pharmacological effects. But there's also a very large component to the experience that I would even dare to say quite boldly can only be explained if we look at this from a different framework that is more concerned with psychotherapy, or maybe even other traditions that try to understand the functioning of the mind. So that's a challenge for all of these therapists. What are the right qualifications for a therapist to do this work safely, ethically, efficiently, responsibly? And then when we look at the components of the therapy, music seems to be one of those components that, again, can really make or break the experience. And then if you look into the way music ideally is being offered, meaning in a highly person-centered way, adapted to the needs of the individual, adapted to the changing needs of the same individual over the hours of the experience, that is also quite complex. Right? So this new generation of care providers is basically expected to both learn how to work with a new class of medicines and really forced almost to change their usual paradigm in how they think about mental health and treating patients. And at the same time, there's also this component of music, which is a whole complexity in itself. So this was also really the foundation for WavePaths, recognizing that and also realizing that there are in fact advances both in the science of psychedelic therapy, the science of human development, but also technological advances in immersive arts, computational creativity, biometrics, that can all be unified to develop this highly intuitive, flexible instrument for care providers and care seekers to really find ways to increase the likelihood of these therapeutic experiences to occur and decrease the likelihood of these counter therapeutic experiences to occur.
So it's not just a matter of playing a musical album that the patient knows of or what the therapist thinks might help the patient, but understanding and studying music as an experience can help psychotherapy, is Mendel's point.
Right. It's very different. And I think the way to maybe start unpacking this is by emphasizing that one of the things we do is understanding how music can be personalized to the individual. So what is the musical language, one might say, that this individual speaks? What are the instruments, compositional qualities, acoustic qualities that this individual is connected to already? And then how can we utilize that language, that connection, to speak to the experience of the individual with music that is implementing or integrating these qualities? So that's one, really ensuring that we build an appropriate musical climate that is truly empathically resonating with the listener, with the patient that is undergoing the experience. But then when it comes to the changing dynamics of the experience within the acute experience, there can be various processes, various topics, various themes, various feeling states, various thought processes, various physical experiences that patients undergo that need attention, that need a particular quality of attention when working in the psychedelic therapy framework. And that quality of attention is usually described as a degree of openness and curiosity towards the unfolding experience as it is, without wanting the experience to be different. And when one approaches the unfolding inner experience with that openness and curiosity and attention, further layers of that experience can reveal itself. Further levels of understanding of oneself can reveal itself. Underneath the anxiety, there's sudden anger. Underneath the anger, there is sudden sadness. Underneath those tears that are currently being released, there is a memory that was forgotten, or a thought that suddenly brings a lot of clarity around a relationship that has been unresolved for way too long, and all the feelings that are accompanying that experience. So there's many ways to phrase these philosophies that are implemented in psychedelic therapy, but at the very end, one might argue that in the very essence, what facilitators, care providers are aiming for is for the individual to become more whole, become more total, more integrative for whatever has happened in the past, and less defensive, less dissociated from various parts of oneself. And those defenses, those dissociations are there always for good reasons, right? Because they were traumatic or overwhelming or too painful. But in a safe therapeutic climate, like in psychedelic therapy, it's an opportunity to become more whole, more integrated. So to bring all of this back to this question of how music ideally is used, and what we mean with person-centered use of music, is really utilizing music to shift the focus of the patient there where the focus needs to be, in order for those therapeutic experiences to be deepened and to be resolved. And in our technology, we, for that reason, literally offer any kind of subjective experience one might imagine that can be facilitated with music, and then the emotional intensity of that experience, all at wish, all on control, to find those sweet spots, so to say, for patients to work through those experiences. And that is partially done manually, but we're also working on various biometric integrations to support that process further. But that will be kind of a high-level summary of how the platform is currently developed. Some therapists refer to it as a thermostat, but a music stat, one might say, or an auditory stat, or whatever. But it's the same ease, the same intuition of switching the temperature in a room or the light in a room quickly, easily, intuitively, without the need to enter all sorts of complicated thinking and planning. That's the same ease that we offer in terms of changing the music to support these changing therapeutic needs of the patient.
So in contrast to a molecule that we would not recommend ingesting from the vial to the mouth, we would definitely recommend the following. If you go to the WavePaths website and create a login, the first thing that strikes is the tagline on the homepage, Experience as Medicine. But when you create the login, you will see a colored display screen which enables you to click through on all sides of the circle and change the tonality and the sound that suits your mood for the day. This is a publicly available information, free-to-use tool on the WavePaths website. But we are sure that WavePaths has much more trade secrets and patents in this space. Let's hear from Mendel.
So we do that both algorithmically and manually. And it's really up to the therapist and the patients how much manual changes are wanted. But those changes can be anything that they deem is important in this moment. Changing an instrument, changing a particular layer of the music, changing the emotional intensity, other qualities in the music, like tone color or pitch or scale, adding various sounds to the music. But algorithmically, we're trying to build these profiles, basically, of patients and see how a person usually responds to music and how that these usual responses would likely translate into an acute psychedelic state. So that's one way how we are automating the process as much as possible and really making it as easy as possible for therapists to take away the thinking and the planning and concerns and complexity that is there. Yeah, and it's really both. It's really both. Often therapists just put in some variables at the beginning and really enjoy the fact that they can trust the system to do its thing, and the smoothness, that the fact that you don't have these transitions from song to song, but it's all a continuous, fluid experience. But then any change that you might imagine can be done, can be implemented as well on top of that. Yeah, we are first of all not working with fixed songs or compositions. It's, like I said before, flexible and adaptive. And the reason why it's flexible and adaptive is because we work with the building blocks of music, the different instruments, the different stems or samples, if you might say. And these are either pre-recorded or generated in the moment. And therefore anything can be blended and mixed and remixed all the time, in real time, to create the desired sonic constellation in this moment for the listener.
Sonic constellation? If you thought that we, as a science podcast, did not talk or like spirituality, we finally spoke of how a subjective musical identity can guide a psychotherapy session, and how technological improvements and innovations can aid in providing a tool to the psychotherapist. In fact, WavePaths has done exactly that. The beauty of this digital therapeutic is that it's already generating revenue, and at the time we spoke to Mendel, it was in use in 11 different countries, including the US, Canada, parts of Europe, and Australia. And another aspect that we came to know of was the fact that different psychedelic substances can alter the oral sensitivity. We asked Mendel if this is true, and if there's an opportunity to make or set a framework for a particular drug by avoiding a few musical attributes and highlighting others. Here's Mendel's response.
Well, it's not known in the public, and this is another example of why I felt there needs to be an organization like WavePaths to really double down on all of these outstanding questions that are so important. And one of them is understanding how sound and music perception is different from different molecule to different molecule, and comparing ketamine, MDMA, psilocybin, all the tryptamines very actively. And that is exactly what we're doing. And I can't disclose too many details on that as we speak, but this is exactly one of the things that we are studying and integrating. Adaptation to the medicine in question, adaptation to the individual traits, and adaptation to the process of this person in a moment. And then really bringing it all together in one framework.
All right. So we spoke to an investor who invests in highly promising companies in the area. We spoke to a digital therapeutics entrepreneur who was convinced, much like many in the area, that music is an experience and an integral part of the psychedelic experience. Yet, the experience is subjective. Beyond the subject itself, no one else can actually see or understand what's happening. The only way to gather information is if the person undergoing the psychedelic therapy talks about their experience, which we know happens in the psychotherapy sessions. Are you ready for the big question? It is something that ties our primary area of technology in healthcare research to the area of psychedelic medicine. What if one can truly understand what is happening to the areas of the brain when someone is dosed with a psychedelic molecule? What if there was a way to understand neural signatures of a psychedelic experience, or inform the physicians which part of the brain surface is active and which isn't? Why is this important? Because you can understand the signature of a patient in therapy at baseline, through therapy, and during follow-up. Imagine the richness in the data that comes from such a technology if it's available. And what if one had such a system? One that informs and provides a better understanding of the human brain under the influence of a psychedelic. Well, we explored that too. Now it is time for you to dig a bit deeper. That was PsychedeRx, a SKRAPS original podcast exploring the therapeutic use of psychedelics. An enthralling story of an improbable drug class, banished into exile, yet comes back soaring like a phoenix from the ashes to save mankind's affliction with mental health disorders. And we are just getting started. There is so much more to do. You've been listening to PsychedeRx. PsychedeRx is a SKRAPS original podcast produced and narrated by Arun Sridhar and Jojo Platt. SKRAPS is a volunteer-run organization created by Arun Sridhar and Jojo Platt to disseminate factful stories of science, scientists, and innovators as a service to the world. Select research for this podcast series was performed by Sharina Rice. The producers thank Clara Burtonshaw for her invaluable input. Multimedia services was provided by Dr. Romeo Ratch. The scripts were written and edited by Arun Sridhar and Jojo Platt. Financial support to cover the production cost was from Cyber Inc. and a kind donor BB. Recordings were done at Caprino Studios in the UK and Slightly Red Studio in San Francisco. Swaminathan Thignanasambandam performed the mixing and mastering. All recordings, including interviews, are properties of the producers and should not be reproduced without permission. The show notes, transcripts, and useful links pertaining to the episode are located at the podcast website, psychederx.com.